Welcome back for another exciting video. This video is going to cover fastener removal and installation, and it's divided into three parts. The first part being nuts, bolts, and screws, second part being plastic retainers, and then the third part being rivets. There are many different types of hardware that you'll come across. The top left shows a collared hex nut, which has a built-in washer, similar to the collared hex bolt on the top right. These can also come in a flange style where the washer portion does not move. Next line shows a nylon hex nut. The nylon inserted into the nut prevents it from coming loose, and these are a single-use item. Next to that is a lock washer. The spring steel in the lock washer also prevents the bolt or nut from coming loose. And then there's a flat washer which allows some movement with the bolt or nut. Bottom left is a speed nut used on studs, such as old nameplates. And then the bottom right is a U-clip or J-nut or H-clip. These are sometimes used behind bolts in place of a conventional nut, so you don't need a tool behind the item you're removing. There are many different head styles that you could see on a bolt, nut, or screw. The hex is the six-sided in the top left, and that is very common. Next to that on the right is the Torx, which also has 6 points, is quite different from the hex. We'll see these on most every vehicle. Underneath that, we see Phillips, which is very common, especially on North American vehicles. In the center is Posi drive. We used to see these on some North American vehicles and European vehicles. Those are not as common today, but they still exist on a lot of vehicles. And on the right is the JIS, which stands for Japanese Industry Standard. They are a slightly different shape in the center, and the angles are a little different on each of these. So although a single tool will fit each of them, using the incorrect tool can, in fact, strip the head, so use the correct tool. In the bottom is the Allen head, also referred to as a hex, but it's internal with 6 sides. Most hardware is right-hand thread, meaning if you look at the head of the hardware as seen here, look at it very similar to how you'd look at a clock. If you turn it clockwise or to the right at the top, we can see that that will tighten the bolt, and you can remember that with the saying righty-tighty. Conversely, you can loosen it by turning counterclockwise the opposite direction, which we'll refer to as lefty-loosey, so it's easy to remember. However, some older vehicles from many decades past used left-hand thread on some of the wheel nuts, and there are some parts of vehicles that may still use left-hand thread for specific reasons to prevent the hardware from coming loose. So if you are working with safety systems or mechanical components, always double check with the OEM procedures in case they could be left-hand thread. If you're having difficulty removing a bolt, ensure you're turning in the correct direction. And remember, this is only true if you're facing the head of the bolt. If the bolt is obscured in a different area, this will not hold true righty-tighty. Just as the hardware comes in different styles, so do the tools to remove them. Hex bolts typically use a hex socket that is 6 points or 6-sided, but you can also use a 12-point socket, which will also work on hex bolts, but it will not grab quite as well as the 6-point, as the 6-point will grab the sides more so than the corners, whereas the 12-point will grab the corners and be more likely to strip. Use an appropriate socket and ratchet to remove the items, of course turning the correct direction. Make sure that the socket slides thoroughly over the head of the fastener. And if you do have to use a combination wrench, you can see this closed end is also 12 points, and then the open end just has 2 sides that will grab. Using the boxed end will grab better than the open end and prevent stripping. If the open end slips out, as we saw, you will strip the edges of the nut as seen here. When trying to access a bolt or nut in a hard-to-reach area, you may not be able to use a socket and a ratchet. A combination wrench like this with the open end and that included 15-degree angle can work really well for accessing and also providing clearance for your hand. The boxed end does a really good job contacting the fastener without slipping off like the open end. There are many fasteners used on vehicles that were not very common in the past. Torx, as we see in the top left, has 6 points, and then the Torx Plus also has 6 points, but the Torx Plus is more blunt. They are similar but are different, so make sure you use the correct tool in the fastener. Also notice that each of these is designed to fit very tight and will create 100% contact. An external or E-Torx in the top right is also seen on some vehicles. The bottom left shows a 12-point triple square, sometimes referred to as XZN. And then the bottom right is a security or tamper-proof version of the triple square. Any of these can be found in a tamper-proof style where you have a hole in the middle of the tool, and then the fastener will have a stud to correspond or fit with the hole, so the appropriate tool will need to be used for that fastener. Always ensure your tool is perpendicular to the fastener and inserted all the way regardless of the style of fastener. Torques are especially prone to slipping out on an angle, which can strip the head out of the bolt or fastener like this. When trying to access hard-to-reach areas, a driver tool like this will work really well. When dealing with fasteners that are very challenging to remove without stripping, an impact driver works very well. Turn the impact driver whichever direction you need to go, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Insert the impact driver over the fastener, and then using a ball peen hammer, hit the impact driver. You will see as you continually hit the impact driver will turn. And the concept here is as you hit the impact driver, a spring inside will ensure that the force applied to the bolt also allows the bolt to turn in whichever direction is desired. This prevents slipping or stripping. This is very useful for Torx bolts on door latches. If you're dealing with a bolt that is spinning and it's not coming out, what you may want to do is try and pry behind the bolt or the washer. And in this case, a fork tool is being used to apply pressure. And this may sometimes happen with a U or J clip, or it could be a strip nut on the back. As we apply pressure, we can see that the bolt comes out quite easily. Make sure you're very careful as these tools could slip out at any point. If hardware is damaged or the OEM specifications say that they are single use, they must be replaced. If you can order the hardware from a dealership, that may be your best route. Otherwise, if you have to replace hardware, especially bolts, make sure that they are equivalent to what you're removing. Bolts, whether they're SAE standard or metric, as seen on the left and right, will have the grading stamped into them. The grading determines how strong the bolt is, whether they're hard or soft, and this is a very important factor for safety. Bolts may also contain Loctite or some kind of thread locker on them. These should be removed prior to installation as it will affect torque values and could also cause the bolt or other hardware to strip. Here a wire wheel is being used. Sometimes gentle heat can assist in removal, or you may be able to use a thread chaser or a die, which we'll discuss shortly. After removing the thread lock, check the OEM procedures to figure out what is the correct type of thread lock to put on there, and then install the correct type of thread locker. If you need to clean up the threads for any reason, a thread chaser kit like this is very helpful. You can use one end of the kit on the bolts, so this is basically like a nut that's going to clean up the thread. It'll thread onto the bolt and remove corrosion or other contamination. And then if you need to clean up a nut, you can use a thread file like this. It can also be used in a hole. Further, you can use a tool like this to get into holes, and it will clean up the holes as well, removing any traces of corrosion or old Loctite. Always remove the old Loctite from both the nut and the hole, especially on important items for safety where you need to torque very accurately, such as seats, seatbelt bolts, etc. If a thread chaser or thread cleaning kit isn't helpful, you may be able to use a tap and die set, which will create new threads. Tap and die sets need to be matched up, as do the thread chasers, and so a tool like this is used to check the thread. So this is called a thread pitch gauge. You find one for SAE or metric, install it, and it should match up to the thread, telling you what type of thread pitch is on there. And if it doesn't match up, then you know that's not the correct thread pitch for that particular hardware. There are many types of plastic retainers that are used on vehicles today. There's no way we can cover all of them, but we'll talk about some of the most common ones you might find on modern vehicles. As such, there's also numerous tools that can be used for removing plastic retainers. Some of the common things that you'll see is a trim pad tool or fork tool. We'll see Christmas tree clips, one-part push clips, non-threaded two-part push clips, and threaded push clips. Sometimes older threaded two-part retainers can be very challenging to remove as they may spin. So you may want to hold the bottom part of the retainer with a fork or trim pad tool or something similar while using an appropriate tool to try and screw out the center portion. As we can see here, this can be quite successful with a little bit of work. If that does not work at all, you may need to pry up on it. So here I'm using a small flat screwdriver to pry the center out, and get the retainer started. From there, I may be able to continue screwing or just prying the retainer out. I may or may not be able to reuse this retainer afterwards, so you may need to consider that you may have to replace it. As I continue prying up on the retainer and screwing, it is starting to come a little bit, but I am finding that it may work a little easier with some additional pressure from the fork tool. So with that fork tool pressure pushing on there we can see that center stud comes out, and there we go, clip is removed. Usually, however, if they're in good condition, we can just unscrew the center portion of the clip. Once the center portion is out, using a fork tool, we can then pop the clip out quite easily. When we're going to install these types of clips, make sure that the center section is screwed out as far as possible or completely removed. You can completely remove the center, put the first part of the clip in, and then the second part of the clip. This is also true for any two-part fasteners, not just threaded ones. Or we can keep the threaded portion in just a hair and then push it in, and that is the installation of the clip. Other two-part clips might work very well by using a fork tool and a small screwdriver to pry out the center, and then using the fork tool to pry out the remainder of the clip. There's also this type of tool which will go underneath the two edges. There may be lips or recesses for the tool to fit into that they can pry against to get the center of the two-part clip out, and then the clip can be completely removed. Door trim panels and other types of trim can be challenging to remove without accidentally damaging the plastic trim panel or the body of the vehicle, such as the paint here. So what we can do to prevent damage is use masking tape or duct tape to tape off the vehicle. That will prevent scratches in the paint, and then insert the tool. Be careful not to damage the panel. So rather than using the fork tool and tape, it may be much safer to use a plastic tool such as this wedge first. Here you can see I can get the wedge inside of there. Once the wedge is in, I can use some more plastic tools like this trim stick and get the trim stick inside there to pry out on the panel. That will prevent the panel itself from being scuffed up. Further, I could put tape on the trim tool itself, so this trim pad tool may be taped off to provide some added layers of protection before inserting the tool and prying on the vehicle. Some other methods that work really well for this type of application would be using a longer tool like this, which has a bend, which allows for more pressure to be applied, but I'd want to put something behind it, such as this thick towel, to prevent damage to the vehicle. If I'm going to use some more of these tools trying to get this trim panel off, I could also use a wooden paint stick to prevent damaging the body. So if I might accidentally dent the body, this piece of wood will prevent that from happening when using a metal tool. To remove other items like this, I don't want to use a metal tool at all. Here we have some leather and hard plastic, which will easily scratch and gouge. So this is an area where I would definitely want to use a plastic tool only. And I can insert the plastic tool and gently pry up wherever the retainers are. As I'm prying up, I'm also using my hand trying to feel where there's resistance. Do not over apply pressure in any one spot, as you could damage the plastic. And if you are pulling and it's not coming out, always check to see if there's a hidden retainer or fastener that you were supposed to remove before prying up on the item. Sometimes we'll have to remove electrical connectors or pigtails. In this case, I was able to easily use my thumb to pull out on this one, but sometimes they're more stubborn, so a small flat screwdriver like this, prying against the tab, may release the electrical connection. If that's not working, then in some cases, depending on the style, I may be able to take a very small pick tool and pry the pick tool in and gently pry up against the end of the tab. There may be a place on there at the end of the tab where this retainer is going to grab onto, and that's where I want to pull apart. Weather strips on doors may be removed by using a small fork tool. However, they can be easily damaged, so make sure that you use an appropriate tool so you don't damage the weather strip or have to replace many expensive clips. Here I'm using a pair of dulled side cutters. Make sure if you have old side cutters and they're not that sharp, keep them around because they may be great for grabbing the tabs to remove these types of retainers. Conversely, here's some tape applied over top of a wire stripper tool. May be very useful at grabbing the tabs to remove that particular retainer. Other methods that can help out too would be using a pick tool, or you could use some spreaders or putty knives to get inside there and try to release the tabs on those clips. Noticing how the door is also taped to prevent scratching or damaging the door itself. We can use these putties knives as well to remove things such as a washer nozzle on a hood. There's often tabs on each end, and we can gently pry up on the tabs using this method, preventing damage to the washer nozzle or the hood itself. When removing a light such as a tail light, never pry. We can damage the lens or damage the body of the vehicle. You may be able to gently push, tap, or slap with your hand to get the tabs released. And here it's a ball and socket joint. So it's a metal tab, sometimes they're plastic, going into a plastic retainer or sometimes metal retainer. When we go and remove these, we can also use other methods such as duct tape. So by applying a few layers of duct tape and then pressing the duct tape very hard, we can use that to help us pull outwards on the light. Be careful though, if we put a lot of pressure on that outer lens, we can actually damage the taillight and separate the lens from the light. Always make sure that all the fasteners are completely removed from the light before ever trying to pull the light out of its position. Here we can see that the tape helped very well in grabbing onto that light and removing it out straight. When reinstalling any type of fastener, you can always apply some lubricant such as glass cleaner to help with installation. Glass cleaner or soapy water will work really well to create some lubrication in installation of these components. This works really well with two-part push clips, so you may want to lubricate these push clips upon removal. You may also find that disassembly is aided by using some glass cleaner or lubricant, as well as installing or removing bumper covers. Belt moldings can be easily damaged if they're not removed carefully. Some belt moldings may be single-use, but at this point, most belt moldings can be removed and reused. Always check to see how they're secured. Many belt moldings will use a plastic tab at one or both ends, in which case you may need to put some tape on to protect the vehicle, and using a putty knife, a small flat blade screwdriver or pick tool, prying on the plastic tab carefully. Others may use a small screw on the inside, in which case use a screwdriver to remove those particular items. This is a belt molding tool that's inserted behind the belt molding, and then you pull out and up to try and release the belt molding. The tool goes behind the belt molding and pulls it open to release it from its retainers. The last part of this video will briefly discuss rivets. Rivets can be used for holding on many parts of a vehicle under single use. They may be made of plastic or metal. If it's a metal rivet, you may need to punch out the center and then drill it out. In this case, this one didn't need to be punched out. We were just demonstrating that for the purpose of the video. This is an aluminum rivet, so it drills out quite easily. A steel rivet may be a little harder to drill out. Drill with low speed and prevent the rivet from spinning. Use a sharp drill bit. To insert the rivet, select the correct rivet and then select the right end of the riveting tool and then insert the rivet and the riveting end into the riveting tool. Make sure the rivet is installed all the way into the rivet tool, otherwise it will not install correctly. And push the rivet all the way into the hole so it is completely flat. Then pull down on the rivet. After each pull, push back down on the rivet tool to make sure it stays flat and perpendicular to the rivet. Continue pulling until eventually the mandrel breaks off of the rivet and then the rivet is tight and secured into place. When removing a plastic rivet, we can use a similar method of punching out the center, and then you can drill it, or in some cases you may be able to use a fork tool and just pry the rivet out of the hole. When reinstalling a plastic rivet, there's one size tool for all rivets. Select the correct size and type of rivet, and then insert the rivet in the hole, also keeping the tool all the way inserted into the hole until the mandrel breaks off of the rivet. Sometimes you may need to cut off the head of a plastic rivet or grind it off. In which case, if you do have to do this, be very careful to make sure you don't cut yourself or damage the vehicle. And that concludes the fastener video. I hope you've learned quite a bit from these techniques so that you'll have better success removing and installing fasteners in the future. Hopefully you'll have fewer incidences of broken or stripped bolts, damaged fasteners, and damaged vehicle components. Thank you.